All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Lydia Caldwell. I'm the Education and Public Programs Manager at Tefra ICA in Reston, Virginia. And we are so pleased that you are all able to join us tonight. And we're excited to be joined by some amazing panelists this evening. So before I jump in, just a little bit of background about this program. This is going to be the second discussion panel for the panel series this year, and tonight's program will focus on art history, curation, art education, and arts management. If you're interested in viewing the first program of the series, which is focused on fine art and art school practice, then please visit the Tefra ICA website. It's posted under our programs tab. Our three panelists, who I'll introduce in a moment, are going to answer a series of questions about degree requirements. They'll provide tips on pursuing careers in their respective fields, and they'll share with the audience their personal experiences and advice. And after the discussion, we'll open it up to a Q&A session with everybody in the audience. So before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the original stewards of the land on which the Tefra Institute of Contemporary Art stands, known today as Reston, Northern Virginia, and the surrounding areas in the Washington, D.C. region, which include the Piscataway and Monohoic peoples, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here today. Just a few housekeeping notes for everyone tuning in. Upon entering the Zoom meeting, you will have been muted, and we kindly request that you keep your microphones off during the program to help us facilitate a clear discussion with the panelists. And during the presentation, you are welcome and encouraged to type any questions that you have for the speakers into the chat function, and we'll go to those first during the Q&A session. But also during the Q&A, I invite you to use the raise hand function if you'd like to pose your question directly to the panelists. And just a reminder that this event is being recorded. So if you don't want to be included in the recording, but you just want to listen to the talk, simply keep your microphone and camera turned off for the duration of the event. And I'd also like to take a second to ask everyone tuning in to tell me in the chat where you're tuning in from. That'll just be really helpful in terms of making sure that this program is publicized through the right channels next time we host it. All right, so without further ado, I'll introduce our panelists for this evening. We're joined by Melissa Jordan Love. Melissa Jordan Love is the Carol R. Engel Academic Curator and Co-Interim Director at the Fralin Museum of Art at the University of Virginia, where she has overseen the Education Department since 2012. Love's career as an art historian, educator, and museum curator spans more than 25 years. Under Love's leadership at the Fralin, the Education Department has grown to host university classes with over 2,000 enrolled students per year, in addition to 4,000 K-12 students in Charlottesville and 9 surrounding counties. Upon her arrival on an Andrew W. Mellon Foundation grant, Love took over a new fledgling museum studies class and developed it into an internship program, adding an undergraduate student-curated exhibition as part of the class experience, which is organized annually by the Fralin student interns under Love's guidance. Love earned a PhD in art history from Columbia University, completing her dissertation research on medieval art and architecture, and she also pursued study in oceanic art, inspired by having lived on Easter Island for a year as a child. Love earned a bachelor's degree cum laude in art history and economics from Wellesley College, and she has previously held curatorial positions at the Worcester Art Museum, the Sterling and Francine Clark Art Museum, and the Sweetwater County Historical Museum in her native Wyoming. We're also joined by Reece Rahilly. After graduating as an Eccles Scholar from the University of Virginia in 2011, Reece spent several years at Sotheby's, New York, working in both Sotheby's Preferred and the Logistics Department, where she coordinated high-value global art shipments. These diverse experiences provided Reece a well-rounded understanding of the commercial art world and helped her transition into the client-centered, logistically complex art fair role she has occupied since 2013, working her way to a director title in 2016. As the Armory show's director of production, Reece works year-round to produce New York's premier international art fair, which attracts 200 gallery participants and 60,000 visitors annually. In addition to overseeing all elements of exhibiting gallery participation and production, Reece focuses on sales and business development through fostering relationships with leading international galleries. She lives with her husband and 2 young children in Charlotte, North Carolina, and travels frequently to New York and other global cities, visiting art fairs and galleries. And last but not least, we're joined by Dena Rapoport. Dena is a museum educator and coordinator of family programs at the National Gallery of Art. In this capacity, she helps families learn together and connect to creativity and to the process of art making. She has a BA in History of Art from The Ohio State University and an MA in Art History from the George Washington University, where she worked as a teaching assistant. Previously, Dena held positions at the Phillips Collection, the Corcoran Gallery of Art, and the National Museum of African Art. She previously attended the Harvard Project Zero Classroom Summer Institute and presented at NAEA and WISSIT. Dena is the co-author of Partners in Learning, Early Childhood Visitors, Their Companions, and Museums, published in Creating Meaningful Museum Experiences for K-12 Audiences, How to Connect with Teachers and Engage Students. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to our 3 panelists, Jordan, Reece, and Dena. Thank you all again so much for joining us tonight. Are we ready to dive in with some questions?
Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you, Lydia.
Amazing. So my first question for you all is, how did you decide to pursue the career path that you're on now? And Jordan, if you want to get us started.
Yeah. I fell in love with art history the first class of the first day in college, and I knew I wanted to major in art history. And so after I graduated, one of the things that I knew that you did was try to get internships and jobs in museums. And so that's what I really kind of pursued doing. And I was really willing to go anywhere to do that. And it was great working some of the really tiny museums to start off with, because I learned a huge amount and did a huge amount of work helping a small team make exhibitions a reality. So just kind of getting into museum work early and then leaving to go to graduate school and then coming back has all kind of built upon itself and on each other. So that's how I really got into where I am now.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Jordan. I'll jump in next. And again, thank you, Lydia, and to the TEFRA ICA for having us and hosting this panel this evening. My sort of journey to the museum world started also with an art history class. For me, it was AP art history, which I feel like might be very rare in a lot of high schools to offer. But for me, something really clicked in that class, that you could study history through the lens of the visual world, and that just sort of expanded and exploded my world in a very cool way. So I pretty much did everything and anything to really continue art history and pursue that as an undergrad, and got involved with our local museums as a way of kind of learning about what art historians do once they finish studying and need to find a job. And that really excited me and had me really interested. So from there, I pursued internships, in particular, an internship that brought me to Washington, D.C., which kind of helped me land where I am today. And really that sort of moment, that internship moment really helped me refine where I wanted to be in museums, because museums are kind of this microcosm for the world. And there's anything from like facilities management up until the director's office. And I really had a chance to think about what it means to work in curatorial, what it means to work in education. And I really love this intersection between bringing art to the public through the education perspective. And so that's where I am today. I really loved the opportunity, like you mentioned, working as a teaching assistant, as a graduate student, and that helped so much in thinking about what it might be like to stand in front of a work of art and engage the public in that way.
All right, so I guess that's me. So yeah, like Jordan and Dena, I was also fortunate enough to take AP Art History, which I fell in love with in high school. But it was actually a very formative trip to Paris with my parents when I was 16. And I remember standing in the Musée d'Orsay. If anyone has been there, it's incredible Impressionist museum. And experiencing what I think, having Googled it, is called aesthetic arrest, and basically just being so overcome with like feeling by this one particular painting by Kuipert. And anyway, it just, that experience of kind of wondering who these people in the painting were, what this painting meant, you know, for history, why was it painted, by whom was it painted? To your point, Dena, like sort of that put into perspective for me how incredibly important art is for sort of telling the story of humanity and social justice. And anyway, I just knew I wanted to work in that world. I was born in New York City and always had a drive to go back there. I love its energy and vibrancy. I don't know if anyone is on the call is from there. But I, like Jordan said, worked really hard to gain internships while I was at UVA, and realized pretty quickly that I wanted to go into the commercial side of the art world, which is, you know, very fast paced, less scholarly, which I miss a little bit because I was very like into sort of school and research. But I started out at Sotheby's, and which is a big contemporary and kind of all sorts of art auction house in New York and all over the world. Started out there and very quickly realized it was not where I wanted to be, which was really jarring as a young woman, having graduated with an art history degree, living in New York. I was like, oh my God, this is my career ladder, but I hate it. I feel like this is a career panel, so I can be honest there. It just wasn't for me. And so I was there for 2 years and left and was like, do I just start over? Do I go back to school? And I think all of us would probably agree the power of networking is incredibly important in all fields, but maybe art especially. And through networking, I secured an interview at the Armory show. I had no idea what an art fair was. And here we are 10 years later, and I'm sort of one of the people running it. And to me, it's been an incredible blend of sort of art history and curation, like front of house sort of client service and relationship building, and then also like production and logistics and getting my hands dirty. And though I miss New York, I love being out of that hustle and bustle just a little, and I get to dip my toe in a lot. So
thank you. My next question for you all is, what does a typical day at work look like for you? So we've kind of touched on how you got into your current roles, but what does it look like now that you're there?
Yeah, my typical day is that there's no typical day. Some days I might be having meetings with, so I head the education department. Academic curators really, it varies from museum to museum. Sometimes they're housed in education, sometimes they're housed in curatorial, sometimes they're seen as a liaison between the two. So there's no one set place for an academic curator. But I happen, at the Fralin, I happen to be the head of education. So as the head of education, I may have meetings between my team and the curatorial team to make sure we're on the same page. Meetings between me and our collections managers to organize works being pulled for classes. There may be days where I'm leading classes. Just last Tuesday, I had 4 classes back to back that I was leading, and talking about the art of pandemics, because this is the advantage of being a medievalist. As a medievalist in the pandemic, you become a very popular person because you know about the Black Death. So there was a lot of changes day to day, week to week. But every Friday mornings I teach the internship class. So that's one constant in my day. But I work a lot with faculty, a lot with students, and then do a lot of coordinating between my department and other departments.
Thank you. Dena? Oh, you're muted.
Apologies. There was probably a loud siren that everyone else got to hear as well that passed through. So anyway, so a typical day for me as a museum educator, that's a great question. So I work in a very, very large institution, and within that, a really large education department. So I have the luxury and privilege of working with a huge group of very smart, very talented people. So our work tends to be very team-based, very collaborative, very consensus-oriented. And within that, I would say that my work is split probably 80% administrative and about 20% that's actually sort of the hands-on component or the interaction with the public. Part of that might be because we are such a large institution. Part of that also might be because we are a federal institution. So there are a lot of processes and protocols that are very much embedded into all of our work. I would say at the heart or the core of my work is lesson design, lesson planning, and interactive design. So that might be something like designing our monthly community event where kind of all ages and all people can come in and engage in the process of art making connected to an exhibition or connected to a particular aspect of our collection. And within that, I might be overseeing weekend staff. I might be coordinating with our facilities team to make sure all of the kind of very kind of detail-oriented components are happening, like the tables are up. We've got our AV set up where it needs to be. And and then outside of that, I teach an after-school art program that teaches young learners how to sketch. And I also facilitate our storytime program. So really thinking about how the museum can be a welcoming and accessible place for young people. And so that drives a lot of what I'm interested in. Beyond that, I think there's an opportunity, I guess the privilege of being at a very large art museum is that you get to be really curious about your collection and your works on view. And so I'd say maybe not a typical day for me, but there's this opportunity to really continue learning from the people around you. And I would say that's another sort of glimmer aspect of the work that I really love. And that keeps me really curious and interested in our work as museum educators.
Thank you. Reece?
Yeah, I mean, a typical day, I guess, I'm not sure how many people tuning in have ever been to an art fair, but, essentially they're these very short, usually just a couple days long events. An hour's the Armory show. It happens for literally 4 days, once a year, sort of right after Labor Day in September. And so my typical day very much depends where in the cycle of the fair production and sale I'm in. People often ask, what do you do for the other 364 days of the year? And I'm like, this is a big event and it takes literally all that time to put it on. And so, I wear many hats in my role, from sort of saleswoman and schmoozer to, event producer to architect and union labor wrangler to relationship builder and manager. And depending on where in the year we are, it all changes. So for example, right now, this year's Armory show happened about 2 months ago. We've taken a little bit of a break and now we are building out our application for 2024. And so while obviously a lot of things remain the same from year to year, our 200 galleries do have to reapply each time. They spend anywhere from $15,000 to maybe $140,000 to just rent a booth. It's an extremely competitive and arduous application process. And so right now we're sort of working through all that. And basically my job is to make sure that we get the best galleries we can get, but also that they they get the best value for money they can have. So I'm working very closely with our general contractor to make sure, and our architect to make sure that our floor plan for next year, where all these galleries will have their booths, you know, has the best sight lines and the most spacious lounges and the, you know, fewest columns as possible. I was in London 2 weeks ago for a big art fair, in New York last week for an art fair, meeting with potential and returning clients to, you know, try to convince them to come back or to do the fair for the first time. You know, and meeting with kind of new business, for example, the U.S. Tennis Association, who hosts the U.S. Open tennis championships. It overlaps with the Armory show, and so we've done partnerships with them in the past, and we're saying, you know, how can we expand on this year and engage both of our audiences more? Because I think to Dena's point, really, of like really reaching a broader public. People want to sell art at our fair, and so you need to be able to spend money, but also the galleries really want to just showcase their art and their artists to the widest range of public possible. So that's a big goal of ours as well.
Thank you so much. I think we sort of started to touch on this maybe in the last question, actually, but I'm curious to know, how did you arrive at this point in your career? Like, a couple of you mentioned specific internships, but were there any of these sort of internships or fellowships, apprenticeships that you would recommend to people in the audience with similar interests?
You know, I wouldn't say from my perspective, there's no specific internship or fellowship that's going to launch you towards the academic curator position. It's just about getting as much experience as you can. And I think one of the things really helped me was starting small. My first internship was at a tiny historic museum in my hometown. It allowed me to live at home. One of the toughest things, especially coming up in this field in the late 90s, was the fact that a lot of internships were not paid or were underpaid. We were very much exploited back in those days. And coming from middle class background, my parents would never have been able to afford to like send me to a city to live for the summer and like earn peanuts. It wasn't going to happen. So one of the things I did was be an intern at my local museum for the summer, and it was paid a little bit, and I was able to work from home and gained a huge amount of hands-on experience, and became really close with my colleagues who became mentors, wrote me recommendations. And in contrast, the following summer, I was an intern at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and I was a preparator. So I learned all about art handling and shipping and packing and all that kind of stuff. And I lived in the basement of a family friend. And so it's about like connecting with people, trying to find ways to make it work for you. And that's one of the reasons I came up with the internship class that we have at UVA now. Is it's a 2-semester class that is half internship with us, and then the other half is coursework, because it allows people to get that hands-on experience if they can't get a summer internship. And recreating that first experience for me was a big thing that motivated me. After I was a curatorial assistant for about 7 years after graduation, I knew that I wanted to get a graduate degree. And I applied for a PhD program because I thought at the time that I wanted to be a curator, and I still could be. So I thought, okay, I was scared though. Applying for the PhD program is a scary thing, but I thought, you know what, I got to go bigger, I got to go home. So I applied to 10 different programs to try to get in and get some funding. And I was able to do that. And then after I graduated, all that museum experience I had helped me land a museum job. But I applied not just to museum jobs, but also teaching jobs, all kinds of positions. And when I saw the academic curator position, I thought, this is great. I can work in a museum, work with objects, and teach. It's like kind of the best of both worlds. And so that's how I really got to where I am right now, and some of those formative things that helped me along the way.
Thank you so much. Dena?
Sure. Yeah, I think we're all naming different internship programs that really brought us to where we are. And for me, I'm no different. I want to name and call out one internship in particular that helped me significantly, and that was through Art Table. Art Table, for those who might not have heard of it before, is an organization that helps advance women in leadership positions working in the visual field, visual arts. And so I applied for a fellowship opportunity that I saw that opened, and it was to take place just after I graduated from undergrad. And I said, like, place me wherever. I'm really interested in kind of diving in. Here's where my interests lie, but I'm really interested in just getting experience. And I was placed at the National Museum of African Art in Washington, D.C. It's one of the Smithsonian museums, and I didn't know a thing about African art. I think on like my first day or first week, my supervisor had said something like, well, maybe we'll turn you into an Africanist by the end of this internship. That didn't necessarily happen, but it really exploded my worldview around what it meant to work in a rigorous museum. I was working for the deputy director, chief curator, doing a lot of research, thinking about working on like an online exhibition that they were working on at the time, and working and liaising with a lot of their fellows that were there for the summer too. So to be working alongside other curatorial thinkers, other artist fellows that were there, as well as interns, just really expanded my worldview by so much. Reece, to Reece's point about the power of networking, it really just helped me meet people outside of, the little bubble that I had been living in as an undergrad. So I'll call out that as one avenue and pathway that really got me to where I am. It got me so excited about living in Washington, D.C. I saw this sort of whole National Mall campus and this museum system that had so many different opportunities that I could possibly pursue. And so that had me interested in coming back to DC and applying to graduate school there with the hopes of landing a job at a museum. So that worked out in my favor. So I'm very grateful for that. I'll also name into what Jordan was saying before, these internship opportunities that happen while you're in school are extremely helpful, especially because of this component of like, how do you pay for life, pay your rent, pay for groceries, and also continue to pursue work in the arts. And so I had applied for a terminal MA at GW, which is all that they offer. And that was a really great way for me to kind of test out where I wanted to be. Did I want to go into curatorial work? Was I really interested in museum education? And it gave me the opportunity to pursue a focus in museum training, which is one of the options. So in my second year of my MA, I applied to different internships, and that's where I had worked at the Corcoran for a semester, and then I was at the National Gallery of Art for another semester, both in the education departments, and it helped me really refine where I wanted to be, and that I really loved this concept of museum education, where we were taking sort of the big ideas that were happening in graduate school and in the scholarly art history world, and bringing them to a place that a young person could have an experience at a museum. And so I loved that creative thinking of like really breaking down what it means to look at art and to experience art and like meaning behind art, and make it really meaningful for all sort of levels and skills and ages and interests. So certainly, yeah, the museum internship while I was in graduate school, as well as the Art Table fellowship that I did, were very powerful experiences to kind of help me to where I am today.
Thank you so much. Reece, do you want to touch on this question?
Yeah, I think that I agree with so much of what Jordan and Dena, both of you said. And I think there's a lot of similarities between the not-for-profit museum institution world and the commercial art world. I think one of maybe the bigger differences is the importance of being in a big city to really dip your toes in and get experience in sort of the heart of the art world. Commercially speaking, I think that I know I would not be where I am today had I not lived in New York. To both of your points, it is so freaking expensive. I don't know how many of you live there. I was there for 10 years. I loved it. I'm exceptionally grateful that I am now in North Carolina raising my family instead of in like a 800 square foot apartment. But it's true that if you want to work for a gallery or any kind of like an auction house, any sort of commercial art adjacent business like art PR, marketing, art tech, being in a large city like New York, Chicago, DC, London, I mean, Paris, if you can make it happen, makes a big difference on your resume. And it's sort of, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. That's kind of what people see. But that said, New York is not, the be all end all for everyone. And I think not pigeonholing yourself if you do find, I guess the pigeonholing thing, I thought that I was going to be a contemporary art specialist. That was like, I graduated from UVA. I worked for an art advisor. I did an internship in New York. And I said, oh my God, contemporary art is all I want. This is me. And then my boss said, just don't pigeonhole yourself. The auction house is really big. You don't know where you're going to end up. Similar to Dena's story, I was put first in the very glamorous sort of VIP relations marketing department of Sotheby's. And then through their trainee program, they float you around. And 6 months later, they called me and said, okay, tomorrow you're moving to shipping and logistics. And as Jordan knows, it's not the most glamorous position. I was like, what? I don't know anything about like shipping a Picasso or like the insurance, or it was so stressful, but it was definitely the most formative 2 years of my entire career, because although I am no longer like in the basement of, the Sotheby's building, learning how to deal with specialists screaming at me, where is this diamond shipment? Or, why didn't you send it with like tarmac security? It's worth $5 million. And just getting screamed at is a really important part of anyone's career trajectory, I think. And if you want to make it in the contemporary art world, on the commercial side, you are probably going to get yelled at one point in your career. And so I think that was a very formative experience for me. But it also taught me that there was more than what I thought was my career ladder. And it taught me that the art world particularly is more of a jungle gym than a ladder. And, as we've said before, networking is such a critical part of figuring out how you're going to climb up that jungle gym. Like I said, I had never heard of the Armory show. 10 years ago, art fairs, Art Basel in Miami was just beginning to like come into the public consciousness. But they were more the realm of like art dealers and museum personnel, like for networking. And now they've kind of exploded on the scene a lot more. But if you had told me 10 years ago that I'd be a director at an art fair, I would say like, what is that? And so staying open-minded. And the last thing I think that has helped get me where I am in my career is being true to yourself, being true to myself. Everything I said about sort of hacking it in, the New York art world and getting yelled at and like dealing with the crazy, glamorous, whatever wild personalities and high value art. It was all amazing. It's all been a lot to manage at times. And I think there was a point about 5 years in when I looked at myself and I said, okay, Reece, you can either sort of deep dive into something that is not really you socially, like make my whole world about the galleries and going to every party and meeting every person and I was like, should I start smoking cigarettes and like wearing all black and hang out on the Lower East Side all the time? Like that was the scene. And I said, well, but that's just not me. I'm like a Southerner. I like to wear bright colors. I like to say y'all. And eventually I learned how to use those perceived weaknesses in my favor. And I'm very proud that I've sort of stayed true to myself, even though maybe the scene is not always like that. And I think it's helped me distinguish myself and make sort of a name for myself, which I'm very happy about.
Thank you so much. I just want to say quickly before I give you another question, I'd like to invite the audience to type any questions that you have for the panelists into the chat. I see we've gotten a few already, and in a couple minutes, we're going to jump over into that Q&A session. So feel free to just keep putting those questions into the chat. And while we wait for those to roll in, I have one more question for you of my own. I'm curious to know what has felt challenging in your career and what keeps you going.
I would say one of the most challenging things you will ever have in any career, no matter where you are, is you will sometimes have to work with toxic people. That is something you will learn. And I've worked at wonderful places, and I've worked at places that just had that one person that made it really difficult. But you know what? Sometimes you can, typically people like that will tend to implode and leave. And so if you can outlast them, then you're good. I also learned that one of the challenges of being in this position is that people will not know whether you curate or educate. Because it says curator. So people have a tough time like defining what I do. And so I frequently have to explain it. But I've also started to recognize, as I'm looking forward in my own career and thinking about someday becoming, say, a director, is that most directors have this tendency to come from the curatorial department. And there's a real bias in the museum world that only somehow curators can be directors. And that's simply not true. And I think that that may be something that a challenge that I have to overcome as I look towards next steps. But the thing that keeps me going is the thank you notes from the classes, the volunteer board or the advisory board people that are like, you should be director someday. I believe in you. I mean, sometimes random people will come up to you and just say the most wonderful things. And I think that's one of the benefit of being in museum education is you get immediate feedback about the exhibitions, about your program, about whether you told a good story about it, you know, whether you were able to connect with them, and for repeated volunteers who come and help out again and again, they may just say how much it means to them, you know, the whole thing. And that's what keeps me going, is it's wonderful positive reinforcement that what you're doing matters, and it matters to a lot of people.
Thank you. Dena?
Yeah, this could be very therapeutic. I don't know. Yeah, challenging. What's been challenging about my career path? I'll say that I think like every career has its burnout moments. Museum education is not alone in that. I think one of the particular aspects that makes museum education so challenging is that you are committing weekend after weekend after weekend to work, to offer things for families because they're in school during the day, they're at work during the day. You are showing up in the evenings, you're showing up on weekends. And kind of to your previous questions about like, what are the things that you did to get here? You know, I worked almost every weekend kind of early on when I started at the gallery. And that really takes a toll on your physical well-being, your mental well-being, your kind of drive to move forward. And I will name that for all of the like tragedy of the pandemic that we experienced, it really washed a lot of that away. And we all saw kind of like what matters, and all of that really bubbled to the surface. And so we really named, like, we cannot go back to that rigorous, in a very unhealthy way, kind of schedule where we're here till like 10 p.m. on a Friday to set up for a big community event on a Saturday. And certainly there are times and moments that call for those very late nights, but to do that over and over, weekend after weekend, where you're not getting breaks, you're not able to spend time with your family, your random day off is like a Wednesday, and you're like, it's like meaningless to me because everybody else is still working at the time. Like, that is very challenging to go through. And there was really no sort of cycle of relief because people want to come to the museum every day of the year. People want to come to the National Gallery of Art because it's a museum, it's a tourist destination, it's a local museum for people that live in Washington, D.C. So to really keep up and meet that demand is rigorous. So like I mentioned, the pandemic really washed a lot of that away and invited this new way of thinking of like, how do we make our work much more sustainable than what we've ever done before? And I so appreciate that thread and that thought. And I think that we're continuing to build that because it is still so fresh and new, and that we're not doing things every weekend, but thinking about really consolidating our work into single weekends or single events that we're doing a lot more, but on single days. And that has made a big difference. In terms of what keeps me going, Jordan, you mentioned the thank you notes. For me, I really appreciate that feedback from visitors. Whenever we do kind of, end of program or end of season response requests, it's always really satisfying to see what people learn, and appreciation from parents, especially if they're young, of their young ones learning at the museum, means a lot to me. I would say that you don't really, or at least where I am, you don't really get that validation from the people that you work with. And it's not because they're mean people or they're mean-spirited, but we work in a very kind of fast-paced, smart institution that is always trying to strive for better. And so within that, you just don't get a lot of that kind of like feel good, sit back and just pat yourself on the back feeling of being really proud. So I'd say that feedback means a lot to me. I'll also say that I think the pandemic for me sort of set me back into thinking about this beginner's mindset. And I've really taken this thought process of, how do I approach things with a beginner's mindset as a way of resetting my interest and my curiosity in learning. And that has made a world of a difference for me kind of, 10, 11, 12 years into my career at the National Gallery.
Thank you so much. Reece, I'll pose the same question to you. What has felt challenging in your career and what keeps you going?
Well, I certainly relate to everything that y'all said about toxic work environment, being overworked, and sort of these late night cycles. Happily, the Armory show, having been there 10 years, I've been able to see the team and sort of the company grow. And thankfully, I now have a team instead of it just being me doing everything, which helps a lot. But I think that those experiences are very formative because you learn from them. And I think at least in certain facets of the art world, there is like this expectation that it's all glamour. And Sylvia, I saw in the chat, you asked a question, why do I keep saying the word sort of glamorous when referring to the art world? And I guess, the art fairs are sort of this coming together of so many different facets of the art world. Just as a brief tangent. So museums, for example, the Fralin had at UVA brought a group up to both like educate their patrons, but also for the curators to sort of learn what is going on. And, there's press, there's celebrities, there's collectors, there are museum personnel, artists, galleries, art journalists, sort of anyone who is art adjacent. The art fair, wherever it happens to be in the year, New York is the Armory show in September. if you want to go to a big fair, that's what you do. Last week, you could go to the ADAA, like American Art Fair in New York. 2 weeks ago, you could go to Paris Plus, which is an Art Basel art fair in Paris. The week prior, I was at Frieze, London, which is a major contemporary and modern art fair in London. You know, in the summer, there's Art Basel in Switzerland. In February, there's Zonamaco in Mexico. The list goes on and on and on. And so I think that because of that global reach that art fairs and the galleries and museums and artists that populate them, because of that reach they have, there's a lot of money that circulates around them, people buying and selling art. There are a lot of fancy dinners and parties and great people watching that comes along with it. Fashion, travel. And so I think that's what kind of the glamour, you know, where that comes from. And to be sure, it's a very glamorous industry. I tell myself that often, especially in the early days when I was like making no money. I was like, but it's glamorous and I love it. But the challenges are of an art fair, which is essentially a giant trade show, are often decidedly not glamorous. And the biggest one I've ever faced in my career was we used to take place at 2 giant kind of warehouses out in the Hudson River of Manhattan, 200 square feet of space for like 200 galleries. And 2 weeks before our show in 2019, the city of New York called us and said that half of our venue was condemned and in danger of imminent and catastrophic collapse. And so we had 20 days to redo the entire fair, marketing materials, printed, you know, gallery floor plans, gallery payments, making sure they didn't pull out, making sure collectors felt safe, like can't even describe signage, the chaos that shrinking fair production, which should take a whole year, into 18 days brought on our team. And talk about long work days. I was literally working 18-hour days for about 2 weeks straight. I lost like 10 pounds because I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. We were just like, so it was crazy, but you realize that you rely on your team. And I think in any industry, you know, not-for-profit, commercial, art world, not, having an amazing team is so important, and knowing how to work with them and rely on them. And I feel exceptionally grateful that I have sort of finally, you know, worked my way to this incredible team. And we all like cried on each other's shoulders and said, buck up, and we got through it. And no one really realized that half the venue was gone, and we put half of it in like a brand new random space, and it was all good. But the thing that really keeps me going, in addition to the fact that I love who I work with, is sometimes I worry, you know, what am I doing that's good for people? I have a lot of friends in the museum world, and to me, it's so obvious, like you're educating the public, you're sort of researching and keeping these precious objects and artifacts like safe and entombed for posterity. And an art fair can feel very transactional. It can feel very, you know, glamorous to a fault. Like, is it just one big party? What's the bigger meaning behind it? And at the end of the day, I remember that, you know, for anyone who's taken art history, there would be no art history without the art market. And in order for important works of art that are social commentaries that, you know, tell the story of, like, you know, anything from sort of feminist, like, liberation, you know, or anger at certain things in politics, or just sort of internal distress that someone relates to when they walk by a painting and they're like, whoa, I'm really depressed, and I think this painter gets me, and I feel better because of that. We are bringing that art to the public, and as art fair organizers, we are really, it's this incredible responsibility that my team and I have to literally create the art market. and decide which galleries and which artists are able to take those expensive booths and rent them and sort of showcase that art as sort of the most relevant and compelling of the day. And hopefully, to sort of take it full circle, a major goal of many of these galleries is to sell their artwork to not only good collectors, but to museums like the National Gallery, like the Fralin, because that then ensures that their young artists or, whomever are indeed like enshrined in these institutions for all time. So art history continues on.
Thank you so much. I'm going to transition us into an audience Q&A. I see that we have a couple questions coming in the chat. Also, I'll welcome the audience if you want to go ahead and use that raise hand function to pose a question directly to the panel. Go ahead and do that now. But in the meantime, I saw that one of the first questions that came through was asking about degree requirements. So I know that we've kind of touched on each of our panelists' personal education backgrounds, but I'm curious to hear, do you feel like overall there's a degree requirement within museums, within art market careers or art fair jobs, or just sort of your take on that for that? I think that was Sue W.
I would say that if you're going to be a curator, if you see yourself going all the way up to director, if that's your vision, you got to have the PhD, because you got to know how to create the scholarship. And you have to be kind of immersed in the field. But certainly there are a lot of other degrees, especially in the last 20 years, a much more diverse body of master's degrees that focus on collections management or focus on art education or focus on a lot of different aspects of art conservation. So there are a lot of different degrees that can help you narrow your focus into one particular area or another. I think the biggest mistake that I made was being too scared to try. I waited too long to start grad school because I was too scared. And once I started it, I was like, oh my God, this is the best moment of my life. I loved grad school. I loved it. And so I feel like you can't know unless you try, because if you start trying it and you realize that you don't like it, you can always drop out. But if you don't try it, you realize that was really the right path, that's a lot of regret. So I would say, don't be scared to try stuff out, because sometimes you can't know unless you try stuff out.
Thank you.
I'm happy to jump in really quickly, and I realize looking at the clock that we're getting close to our time. But I want to mention that I think a lot about this actually, because when I was on the cusp of graduating from my undergrad, I asked for advice from a museum education professional. I said, do I degree in museum studies? Do I pursue museum education? Because that was it was still fairly new at the time. Or do I just do traditional art history? And she said, all those fields are really new. People are looking for art history degrees. So I said, okay, I'm going into art history. And I will tell you that now that I am where I am now in this large museum with a very large education department, I see people with art history degrees. I see people with art history degrees plus degrees in art education. I see former school art teachers who I work with now, studio professionals or studio art professionals who came into museum education focused folks, museum studies focused folks. And so I want to say that I think like that's what makes our education department really exciting and vibrant, is that we have a lot of give and take because of all the different pathways and talents and backgrounds that people come through. So don't be afraid to kind of pursue that. And I think maybe the world is a little bit more used to museum education than it was, I don't know, 15 or so years ago.
And I'll just throw in on the commercial side of things, definitely not the same sort of requirement or expectation. Although many entry-level positions at like galleries will say they want you to have an MFA, which I think is just crazy. And I think it's their way to weed out like the gajillions of applications that these big New York City or London galleries get. I would say if you're ever faced with a sort of entry or mid-level job in the commercial art world, I think that you let your experience and your knowledge and what you feel like you're capable of rule the day, and don't let a stated degree requirement put you off, because it's not the same as the museum world in my world.
Thank you so much. I want to be mindful of our panelists' time, so we'll wrap things up. But I know I speak for everyone when I say thank you so much for that valuable advice and your insights into your careers. I know that your responses were also thoughtful, and I'm sure this will be a real resource for a lot of emerging professionals in the art world, and I'm excited to hear from them soon too. I'd like to thank everybody also for joining us today. I hope that the discussion has been helpful to you. I'm sure it has, given our wonderful panelists. But if you'd like to revisit anything that we went over today, I just want to reiterate that the program has been recorded and it'll be available on all of the Tephra ICA platforms, our YouTube channel, our website, and you'll also be hearing from us through a post-program follow-up email, and the recording will be there as well. If you're local to the DMV area, I want to mention that Tephra ICA does predominantly in-person programming at our gallery space in Reston Town Center. And this Thursday, we'll be joined by Joanna Goman from the National Museum of Asian Art for an Insights program. So we'd love to see any audience members who are local come and join us in the gallery. But thank you, panelists, again for all of your time. And we hope.
Lydia, I just say, in the spirit of networking, if anyone wants contact information or whatever, I'm happy to, if people have follow-up questions or anything.
Thank you so much. Well,
thank you guys. Really nice to meet everyone. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you
Thanks for having
including me.
us.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Good night.